I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the kind of internationalist approach of the Red Deal and why when we wrote this, we really had more than just the United States and its consumption-based economy in mind, and thinking about holistically, what does it mean to be good relatives, not to white supremacist nations like the United States or white supremacist empires like the United States, but to the rest of the world. And I think, as Justine had pointed out in her talk previously, that we have a special obligation as people who are living within the belly of the beast, so to speak. Those of us who are of the United States, but not entirely of the United States, if that makes sense. And I want to begin by talking about two climate summits that happened today that really represent two divergent paths that we are on right now. The first is the one that was convened by Joe Biden in the leadership summit that happened today. And the second one was convened by the plurinational state of Bolivia, where social movements and heads of state gathered to offer an alternative to the climate imperialism being espoused by people such as Joe Biden. And what we're really confronting, and I think Melanie pointed this out at the beginning, is what we're really confronting is challenging the idea that somehow the United States should be leading by example for the rest of the world, when in fact the United States needs to be paying its debts to the rest of the world, paying what we conclude the Red Deal on is paying its climate debts. So thinking about what role do indigenous people play in this current energy or in this current transition scenario, especially those in the global north, because we didn't write this document to dictate to the rest of the world how they should run their movements or the things that they should advocate for. But in fact, we listened deeply about their concerns and decided how we can write something from in the belly of the beast that would make the most impact. And so I want to kind of position indigenous movements within a broader framework. So if we think about ongoing emissions, carbon emissions into the atmosphere, the United States and Canada combined put out about 1.7 billion metric tons of carbon emission each year, which is quite a bit. And currently, indigenous movements within the United States and Canada are challenging about 27% of those emission standards. Anything ranging from carbon projects or fossil fuel projects such as the Dakota Access Pipeline to the now defeated Keystone XL pipeline. And so far, that means about 27%. That means about 500 or half a billion metric tons of carbon emissions are currently in question because indigenous movements are the most confrontational arm of the environmental justice movement right now. So even though in places like the United States, we're less than 1% of the total population, or in places like Canada, I think the percentage is around 5%, we play an outsized role in doing our part in making sure that the United States isn't the leading hegemon for climate catastrophe, right? So if we think about this in terms of the Biden administration's recent proposal to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, which we can all agree is a step in the right direction. But the World Bank recently issued a report suggesting that 3 billion tons of metals and minerals like copper and lithium will be required by 2050 for wind, solar, and geothermal power to meet the base target of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so in places like the United States, this means maintaining levels of consumption, energy consumption, right? There's no plan to like limit those energy consumptions. And in fact, according to Biden's plan, he wants to transition the federal fleet into the federal vehicle fleet into an electric vehicle fleet. Right. So pretty soon, according to the green energy revolution that Biden is proposing, migrants won't be running from fossil fuel powered vehicles or gasoline powered vehicles. They will be running from electric vehicles, probably made by companies like Tesla. Right. So this is the future that Biden has in store for us right now, and the current neoliberal plan that he has for the rest of the planet. This also includes plans that Senator Elizabeth Warren has called for, which includes greening the military. So not only will human rights abuses be committed with a carbon footprint, they will now be committed with a with a the satisfaction of they'll be carbon neutral emissions or carbon neutral human rights violations. So, where does this leave us in this particular moment? So, oftentimes we think that the only two options that we have in the United States are the options between Democrats and Republicans. When we know that both Democrats and Republicans have both expanded and continued the US war on terror or waging economic wars through sanctions and blockades against other countries that present an alternative to the neoliberal capitalist order. So increasingly, we know that the Venezuelan crisis in oil production is linked to North America. So under Obama's administration, during shortly after the beginning of the Great Recession in 2008, there commenced a fracking revolution, right? And under Obama's energy policy, which was an all of the above on energy policy, which later became, American energy independence, it meant developing domestic oil. So under Obama's two terms of presidency, domestic oil production increased 88%, right? And this was specifically targeted at a country like Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves, right? It was a way to quote unquote wean the US economy from oil imported like countries such as Venezuela or even Iran. So what happened under Obama was a tightening of sanctions against a country like Venezuela. But it wasn't just to get at Venezuela. It was also to get at countries like Cuba, right? Where we now know that the Moss family, an infamous billionaire Cuban American clan, is responsible for which is responsible for the subversive and legislative attacks on Cuba in the U.S. Congress. It has accumulated much of its wealth from fossil fuel extraction on indigenous lands, and in fact had been one of the major funders of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So here we have, an anti-Cuban, anti-communist legislative bloc that is also profiting from the plundering of indigenous lands for domestic oil production, right? And the reason why isn't just because somehow they just hate Cubans or they hate Venezuelans. It's because Cuba and Venezuela, as we argue in the Red Deal, actually present a real viable political alternative to neoliberalism and climate change. And as we talk today, as Melanie had mentioned in her introduction, Bolivia is currently hosting its own climate summit. And the reason why Biden actually is hosting his climate summit today is because traditionally or historically since 2009, Bolivia has kept April 22nd or Earth Day as its kind of day to celebrate the rights of Mother Earth. But since the U.S. backed coup against the Bolivian government through the party MAS and the president Evo Morales, the coup government under Áñez actually decided to pull Bolivia from that slot, and so in its place, the United States or Joe Biden has held his own summit, right, to basically fashion his wares, which in my estimation is really just it's really just an expo for Tesla and the kind of green energy solutions that are happening in the United States.